Matthew 26 and verse 57. And those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Now Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard, and he went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last, 2 false witnesses came forward and said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." Then the high priest arose and said to him, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest answered and said to him, "I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have of witnesses? Look, now you have heard his blasphemy. What do you say?" And they answered and said, "He is deserving of death." Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ, who is the one who struck you?" Now Peter sat outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him, saying, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." But he denied it before them all, saying, "I do not know what you are saying." And when he had gone out to the gateway, another girl saw him and said to those who were there, "This fellow also was with Jesus of Nazareth." But again he denied with an oath, "I do not know the man." A little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter, "Surely you also are one of them, for your accent gives you away." Then he began to curse and to swear, saying, "I do not know this man." And immediately a rooster crowed. Then Peter remembered the words of Jesus, who had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So he went out and wept bitterly. So what I'd like us to do is think about the way Matthew tells the account of the trial of Jesus. And we've read the first part of the trial narrative. And what I want you to see is Matthew tells the story of the trial of Jesus by contrasting Jesus with other characters. So first of all, Matthew contrasts Jesus and Peter. Then the second thing that Matthew does is he contrasts Jesus and Judas. So look at chapter 27, and you get 2 verses about Jesus, verses 1 and 2, and then you get 3 down to 10 on Judas. So there's a contrast there. And then the third thing Matthew does in talking about the trial of Jesus is he contrasts Jesus with Barabbas. So it's so from verse 11 to 14 we have Jesus before Pilate, and then from verse 15 down we have the story of Barabbas. So it's a set of comparisons. Jesus is the constant figure, but then we have Peter, Judas, Barabbas serving as contrasts to the experience of Jesus. And that's very deliberately done, because Matthew could simply tell the story without inserting the Peter, the Judas and the Barabbas stories. He seems to take the trial and put these other three stories in between, rather than simply tell us the whole of the trial narrative. So this is done for a reason. And what I want to do this evening is look at the way that Matthew contrasts Jesus and Peter. So that's why we read from verse 57 to verse 75. And what I want you to notice is that both the story of Jesus and Peter here are stories about interrogations. Jesus is first of all interrogated, but so is Peter. Peter is interrogated by these servant girls, by these three individuals. And very deliberately, Matthew is saying, here are two accounts of interrogations. And when we see that side by side, here's Jesus being interrogated and here's Peter being interrogated. You all know, don't you, that what we are meant to do is to compare the interrogations and we are to contrast them, okay? That's a standard way, isn't it, of making sense of our Bibles. If we think one passage is linked to another, then we compare them, and then we notice the differences. So here then are two interrogation narratives. And we have the Jesus interrogation narrative first, verses 57 to 68. Then we have the Peter interrogation narrative from verse 69 to 75. But did you notice the way Matthew very cleverly links the experience of Jesus and Peter together? He does it right at the start. Did you notice when we read? If you look at verse 58, Matthew draws your attention to Peter. Now he's doing this to couple them, to link both of them together. We know, don't we, from the other Gospels that John also went to the high priest's place, that John also went into the trial. But Matthew doesn't tell us anything about John. He identifies Peter and he puts Peter in the frame so that we can then compare what happens with Jesus and what happens to Peter. So look at verse 58. But Peter followed at a distance. Now, don't forget, there's no spiritual significance to that. It's simply a fact. Peter followed him at a distance to the high priest's courtyard. Then he went in and sat with the servants in order to see the end. Now that is an absolutely amazing statement. Peter saw everything. He witnessed the entire trial. He saw the unfolding drama, but he also saw the way that Jesus was mocked and beaten and humiliated. Peter saw everything, okay? But look at verse 58. Peter went in with the servants and sat and stayed to the end. Now, I want you to think about that after we finish, okay? What does it mean when Matthew says Peter went in and sat until the end? Does he just mean the end as in, the time it finished? Or is he trying to kind of hint at a deeper significance there? But verse 58 of Matthew 26 is how Matthew links the interrogation of Jesus with the interrogation of Peter. Both stories run side by side. So let's look at them then. If you ask, what's the context for these two interrogations? The first is the interrogation of Jesus, which is at the high priest's residence, a palace, I suppose. So Jesus will be interrogated there. But if you look at verse 69, the context for Peter's interrogation is in the courtyard. Now, the courtyard has been mentioned a couple of times. Peter, in verse 58, goes into the high priest's courtyard. He then goes in to see the trial of Jesus, and then he comes out. And when he comes out and sits back in the courtyard, Peter will undergo his own interrogation. Okay, so the context is the high priestly residence for Jesus, and then the courtyard for Peter. That's the first thing to notice. Then what you need to see is if these are two interrogations, what's the accusation? And so in the story of Jesus, there is trouble about the accusation. The elders and the chief priests and Caiaphas, they all want Jesus dead. They want to kill him. But what they can't do at this point is find an accusation against him. And do you remember when we started this in Matthew 26, at the beginning of the chapter, the high priests and the scribes and the elders, they didn't want to move against Jesus at this point. They wanted to wait until the Passover was over. So they were playing a long game. But Judas, suddenly coming to them, willing to reveal the whereabouts of Jesus, Judas forces their hand. So they act earlier than they intended originally. So, of course, when it comes to the trial then, they haven't got an accusation to make against him. They got nothing to charge him with because they weren't ready. And they weren't expecting to do this at this point. So look at how this is emphasized now in the way Matthew tells the story. There is no accusation that they have at the beginning. Look at the verses 59 and 60. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found none. That they found none is repeated. And it's repeated to emphasize the fact there is nothing they can accuse him of. No matter how much they try, no matter how many people they are prepared to bribe, they can't. And so it's as if one after another, after another, after another false witness comes forward and they've got nothing. They can't find grounds on which to level a legal case against Jesus that means he's deserving of death. So that takes some time to get the accusation together, to get the charge against Jesus. And so in verse 60 we get, but at last 2 false witnesses came forward to put him came forward and said. So you get the sense that this is rushed, it's chaotic, it's far from due process, it's being made up as they go along. These men are scrabbling around to try and get anything they can against Jesus to accuse him and find him guilty of death. And then eventually they find these 2 people who got some memories of a sermon Jesus preached a while ago about the temple and about if you destroy the temple, he will build it in 3 days. And of course, he was talking about his own body. So it's a scrap of a memory of a sermon that they can eventually find 2 people willing to offer as the basis for the charge against Jesus. So loads of trouble, lots of effort is put in at the last minute to find an accusation against Jesus. And there it is, that he is being accused of destroying the temple. So it's a sin against the temple, and it's a false claim that he will rebuild it again. And as you go down to verse 62, you can see the way then that the high priest presses this charge against Jesus. He's found something he can use, and then he's grabbing it with both hands, and he drives it home now in his efforts to get a confession from Jesus. He wants Jesus to confess his guilt, as he sees it, to this charge. So verse 62, do you answer nothing? What is it that these men testify against you? I put you under oath by the living God. This high priest is desperate for Jesus, by his own words, to admit the guilt of the charge. And so what Matthew does, he gives us a summary in verses 62 and 63 of the pressure the high priest starts to put on Jesus. And he rackets it up, if you like, to get Jesus to say something, to admit to the charge that has been leveled against him. The accusation against Jesus then. So go across to the Peter story, and what's the accusation there that's being made? Well, it's made 3 times, isn't it? And the accusation, 69, 71, and 73, is this man, you knew Jesus of Nazareth. You were one of the disciples. You were one of his. Your accent gives you away. The accusation against Peter is that he is a disciple of Jesus, that he is implicated, therefore, in the charge brought against Jesus. He's implicated in the blasphemy. He's implicated in the rebellion of Jesus. Peter has a part in it. That's the accusation. Now, the high priest makes the accusation against Jesus, but we get these servants, don't we, making the accusations against Peter. Verse 69, a servant girl. Verse 71, another servant girl. And then verse 73, a little later, those who stood by came up and said to Peter. Now again, you see, it's getting more intense. A servant girl, and then a number of people. There's an increase in the pressure that's put on Peter, the accusations being made by these people to Peter. But the accusation is he is one of the disciples of Jesus, therefore guilty by association, guilty of equal blasphemy against the temple. So do you see then, these 2 stories run together. They're both stories of interrogations. They have contexts. They have accusations. So let's think next about the response. What's the response of Jesus to his accusation? And what's the response of Peter to the accusation that he faces? And here is where you are meant to see a really big difference in these 2 interrogation stories. What's the response of Jesus? Now remember, the high priest is putting pressure on Jesus for him to confess to the accusation, to confess his guilt. So look at verse 64. He's been silent now. Jesus has been silent, and his silence is remarkable. But in verse 64, he breaks his silence. Jesus says to him, to the high priest, "It is as you said. Nevertheless, I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven." What does Jesus do? Well, he confesses, doesn't he? But he's not confessing in the way that the high priest wanted. He's not confessing his guilt in relation to the accusation. He is confessing who he is, that he is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's not confessing. Now, we need to be careful. He's not confessing that he's guilty of what the high priest is claiming. Jesus confesses the positive statement of who he is. And he confesses that they will see him on the judgment day. And that's an amazing men who are interrogating him, that they will live to see him interrogate them, that they will be the subject of judgment and interrogation. So Jesus points them forward to the second coming, to when Jesus is at the right hand of the power and he comes on the clouds. He points them to that day of judgment whereby Christ will set up his judgment throne, and he will call all men to him, and he will judge according to their deeds. And can you imagine, the one who's accused is saying that I will be the judge. And the ones who are in this story, the judges, will one day be the accused. And Jesus is pointing them to a great reversal of the roles that are currently in operation. And that's the confession Jesus makes. A confession about his nature as Christ, his position as the Son of God, the authority that God has given him to judge all men. Here is one man standing alone, and then he tells them of the ultimate judgment that human beings will face. That's the confession he makes. Now, if you think about Peter, what's Peter's response to the accusation? And of course, what you have is the opposite of confession. Peter denies. So Matthew is putting these two stories together so that you see in the one with Jesus, it's a story of positive confession. And then in the other, the story of Peter, it's denial. And it's not just denial once, it's denial 3 times. And there's this marked difference then between the two at this point in the way that Matthew tells the narratives. And all of us know, don't we, that the number 3 here, so 3 accusations, 3 denials, that looks back to Jesus in Gethsemane, when Jesus 3 times prayed in his struggle in the garden. And do you remember when we looked at that and we saw the first time Jesus prays in the garden, there's that clash between what Jesus wants and the fixed will of God. And then Jesus walks back to see Peter and the other 2 sleeping. He looks at these men, Peter and the other 2. And as Jesus looks at them, he remembers, doesn't he? It's for these men that I'm going to go to this cross. And it's for their sakes that I'm going to die. And so he goes back a second time and prays. And his own desires then, if it is possible, that's gone. And he submits to the will of God. So the very one, Peter, upon whom he looked, as Peter slept, when Jesus struggled in the garden, and then submitted to the will of God, here is that very one now, Peter, denying Jesus. And the denials, just like the accusations, the denials increase in intensity. So do you remember the accusations, a servant girl, and then the crowd? So the accusations build in intensity. Peter's denials also build in intensity. So as you look at them, verse 70, I don't know what you're saying. Verse 72, I don't know this man. And then verse 74, he began to curse and to swear before saying, I do not know the man. So Peter has got more than one chance to retract his denial. But instead, his denials get firmer and more determined and more vehement as each denial is replaced by the next. And that language of verse 74, Peter cursing, swearing, seeking to fit in with the crowd around him, really very, very powerful and very emotional. And so Peter denies whilst Christ confesses in the way that Matthew tells the story. So we got one last thing to look at then in these 2 interrogation narratives. And it's the story of consequence. Accusation, response, and then we end with the consequence. So what was the consequence for Jesus as who he is? Well, you see it there, don't you? Verse 65. Then the high priest tore his clothes, saying, "He has spoken blasphemy. What further need do we have? Look, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think?" So the high priest is acting like a chief prosecutor, and the others, the elders and so on, the scribes, they're a bit like a jury. He says, "Look, we don't need to go any further. We don't need any more evidence. We've got enough. What do you all think?" And he's putting pressure on the jury, if you like, to pass their verdict. And that's what they do. Is verse 66, he is deserving of death. That's the verdict. And then following the verdict, we get verses 67 and 68. Then they spat in his face and beat him, and others struck him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Christ, who struck you?" Do you remember a few days back, I asked you, what's the most famous sermon, one of the most famous sermons ever preached? What is it and where's it from? And we discovered, didn't we, it's from Deuteronomy. And it's a sermon preached and given the title, "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." Do you remember? And a sermon preached in the 18th century by Jonathan Edwards. It's got the title, "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." Now, when you come to verse 66 and 67, what you have is God in the hands of angry sinners. It's the exact reversal of the title of the sermon preached all those years ago. Here is Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, and he's in the hands of angry sinners. And boy, are they angry. And John will reflect on this when he opens his gospel for us. And he'll talk about the light coming into the world. He'll say the darkness did not understand it, but the darkness sought to overwhelm it. And then in chapter 3, men love darkness rather than light because their deeds are evil. And what we get in verses 66 and 67 is the darkness of the human heart and what men would do to God if only we could, without any restraints, without any work of God to hold us back. How would we treat God if we could? Well, that's what we see here. These are the lawmakers of Israel. These are the officials, the leadership, the religious men, the very top of society. And yet they have God in their hands. And this is what they do to him. Spitting, striking, mocking. And that's not telling us that these are a uniquely evil group of people. What we have here is a truth about human nature. Because of sin, all of us, if we had God in our hands and we were without restraint, this is what we would do. It's the depth of the sinfulness of the human heart in response to God. And so Jesus suffers at their hands in this way. And of course, Matthew gives you much more detail about the Jewish nature of the trial of Jesus than he does about the Roman trial. We just get a couple of verses, 11 to 14 in chapter 27, about the Roman trial. But he really wants to tell you about the Jewish trial and what Jesus experienced. So there's the consequence. God in the hand of angry sinners. So let's finish with Peter. And what's the consequence in the story of Peter? Well, in the story of Jesus, there was a verdict. And the verdict is he is deserving of death. Verse 66. As you look at the interrogation of Peter, there's a verdict there, isn't there? Can you see it? What's the verdict? And the verdict, of course, is given for us by Matthew himself. The verdict in Peter's inquisition is that Jesus is right, because Jesus predicted it. Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So the inquisition of Peter verifies Jesus, validates Jesus. It's probably a better word than that. Vindicates Jesus. The trial of Peter is exactly as Jesus said it would be. It's worked out exactly as Jesus predicted. And so the verdict that you look for in that interrogation is the rightness of Jesus, the omniscience of Jesus, the fact that Jesus is God and holds all things together and knows all things and works all things out for good. So the verdict in Jesus is death. That's the verdict in his interrogation. But the verdict in Peter's is the rightness of Jesus, that he is right in all that he says and does. But there's one last thing to say, isn't it? The response is the vindication of Jesus, but we then get Peter going out and weeping bitterly. That final statement, that Peter goes out and weeps bitterly, is the equivalent of what happens in verses 66 and 67 with Jesus, that he's spat on and beaten and mocked. Jesus has suffering inflicted on him physically. He has this torture. He suffers in his body. Peter suffers too. But Peter suffers in his conscience. Peter's suffering isn't physical. Peter's suffering is in his conscience, where he has been convicted of his own failure to do what he had promised. He had promised that if all others forsake Jesus, I will still be with you. He cannot keep his own word. And so he suffers in his conscience. And that when your conscience is causing you to suffer, then that's bitter indeed. And that's what Peter is knowing, bitter suffering. But he might not have been able to keep his word. But the Jesus who said, before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Jesus has kept his word, even through the experience of Peter's own interrogation. So this is the first part, the first stage, if you like, in the way that Matthew tells the story of the trial of Jesus. I don't know when, because next Sunday is Resurrection Day, so I don't know when we'll get a chance to look at the rest of the trial. Jesus compared to Judas, and then Jesus compared to Barabbas. Perhaps we'll find a way of doing so. But at least what we've done so far gives us a sense in which we can approach the trial narratives in the Gospel of Matthew. So if you want to make a look at it yourself, see what you make of the way Matthew tells the story. And then, of course, what we have is we come to the next chapter, 27, and at verse 32, is it, I think? We then have the actual crucifixion itself. And we have the details that Matthew gives us of that crucifixion from verse 32 onwards. And perhaps we'll get a look at that